What if your army laid down its guns, not in defeat, but in defiance? In July 2025, while most nations braced for war, one African country made a declaration that stunned the world. 8,000 soldiers were to be redeployed, not to battlefields, but to farmland. No ceasefire, no negotiation, just a radical shift in command from rifles to rakes, from defense posts to rice paddies. The world paused. Was this desperation or design? But in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't beg for food, he didn't call for help, he called for seeds. Because in his eyes, the real war wasn't being fought with bullets. It was being lost in empty stomachs, barren soil, and the quiet dependence on foreign hands. This isn't just a policy, it's a redefinition of sovereignty, a battle for dignity, a silent revolution. And what began as a single order may end up changing the meaning of power across the entire continent. Is this a gamble or is it prophecy? If you believe Africa is finally awakening on its own terms, subscribe and stay with us. This story deserves to be told until the very last word. On a still morning in July 2025, a presidential announcement came across Burkina Faso's state television. It wasn't about a military victory. It wasn't about peace talks. It was something no analyst had predicted, and few in the world had the courage to understand. President Ibrahim Traoré had issued a direct command. 8,000 active volunteer fighters were to be reassigned to farms. There was no ceremony, no national applause, just the bluntness of reality. The battlefield, he said, is now the soil. This wasn't a demobilization. These young men and women were not being dismissed. They were being redeployed into what the government called agricultural combat zones. Footage began to circulate, long lines of soldiers still in uniform marching into villages, not with rifles, but with hoes and seed sacks. They were digging wells in parched provinces, planting cassava under the national flag, and constructing greenhouses in lands once scorched by insurgency. Their weapons were now irrigation maps, soil analysis, kits, and compost. But the real shock came when the Ministry of Agriculture quietly revealed a hidden chapter. Before this public shift, 2,000 of these fighters had already completed a 3-month secret training in modern agronomy, sustainable land use, and even rural health. They weren't improvising. They were executing a coordinated mission. The message was unmistakable. These men were not laid off. They were leveled up into the front lines of national survival. And for President Ibrahim Traoré, this wasn't just about feeding people. It was about rewriting the definition of national defense itself. In Burkina Faso today, hunger is the enemy, seeds are the ammunition, and the uniform is no longer a symbol of war. It's a badge of reconstruction. But what seemed like an ambitious farming initiative would soon unfold into a radical re-engineering of the entire state's identity. At first, it looked like just another repurposing of idle manpower. But as the weeks unfolded, Burkina Faso began to change not just in fields, but in spirit. Villagers who once feared the sound of boots now welcomed it. Children who used to run from soldiers now ran toward them with watering cans and tiny shovels. In one village, a group of retrained fighters, known as the Green Brigade, did more than plant crops. They repaired broken bridges, they dug solar-powered wells, they restored irrigation canals that hadn't seen water in a decade, and they did it without orders. It wasn't a top-down project, it was initiative, an instinct born not from war, but from a reclaimed sense of purpose. Former fighters became community engineers, educators, protectors, not with guns, but with grit. They had been taught to protect the land with bullets. Now they were healing it with their hands. As one ex-VDP told local radio, "When I carried a rifle, people feared me. Now they call me when their child is sick or when a road collapses. That feels better." This wasn't just a shift in employment. It was a shift in identity, in dignity, and in national memory. And for many of these young men, once abandoned by the system, scarred by trauma, it was the first time they had been seen not as threats, but as builders of a future. But if healing villages was just the beginning, what would happen when this movement reached the nation's political core? As the images spread, soldiers planting rice instead of laying mines, repairing schools instead of guarding checkpoints, Burkina Faso began to awaken. Billboards went up across major cities. Our food, our freedom. State television replaced commercials with irrigation tutorials, and in classrooms, children now read new chapters titled "Food Sovereignty is National Sovereignty." This wasn't a PR stunt. It was a psychological campaign, a deliberate rewiring of the national reflex. For decades, Burkina Faso had been taught to expect famine, to wait for aid trucks bearing foreign flags to survive on plastic sacks labeled donation. But now those same villages were sending produce to neighboring districts. Regions once fully reliant on the World Food Programme were reporting surpluses, and the youth, they stayed. Surveys from agricultural deployment zones showed a stunning drop in migration intent. Young people who once dreamed of fleeing to Europe now spoke proudly of their fields, their communities, their land. It wasn't just about planting food, it was about reclaiming time. No more waiting, no more begging, no more surrendering the future to outside hands. Traoré's strategy wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but it struck deep because it challenged the most dangerous belief of all, that Africans must wait for help in order to live. In that silence, something louder than speeches began to grow: self-respect, rooted in self-reliance. But while the Burkinabe people were reclaiming the soil, the international community was watching with a very different set of questions. In the shadow of crumbled infrastructure and decades of neglect, something unprecedented was happening. Burkina Faso's abandoned spaces were coming back to life, not by foreign contractors or international NGOs, but by young men once seen as tools of war. In the eastern provinces, newly trained VDPs, sent initially to farm, discovered that the only road connecting their fields to nearby markets was impassable. There were no engineers, no state support, no aid group on standby. So they opened borrowed construction manuals. They gathered villagers. They rebuilt it by hand. 3 weeks later, that same road carried produce into markets silent for months. Fresh crops flowed where only dust once ruled. Elsewhere in the north, another team restored an abandoned school. They patched leaking roofs, scrubbed graffiti from classroom walls, and even recruited volunteers to teach. Not a single dollar of foreign aid was spent. Not a single permission slip was signed. What had begun as an agricultural mission had mutated into something far larger, a grassroots wave of rural reconstruction. And the result wasn't just visible in bricks and crops, it echoed in people's faces. Trust was returning. Where there was once suspicion and tribal tension, there was now shared labor, Former fighters once feared for their weapons were now welcomed with food stories and even songs. This was no accident. This was what happens when the state stops outsourcing its future and starts living inside its own people. But every revolution, even a quiet one, eventually challenges not just physical structures, but political power itself. And that was the real test now beginning to emerge. Burkina Faso had always been seen as fragile, brittle at the center, fractured at the edges. But now, a subtle force was reshaping that center, not with decrees from the capital, but through consistent acts of service from the margins. In remote areas where government was once just a rumor, the presence of former fighters cultivating fields and rebuilding infrastructure became a new kind of statehood. One village chief, after watching his region slowly transform, said it plainly: "We no longer wait for government. These young men are the government now." This quiet shift began unsettling the political elite. For decades, central power had been maintained by dependence on foreign budgets, foreign food, foreign validation. But Traoré's strategy turned that pyramid upside down. It empowered those without titles. It decentralized authority by localizing ownership. And that scared people in power. Internationally, some observers applauded the model as homegrown development. Others warned it was anti-aid populism. Diplomatic channels buzzed quietly with questions. Would this movement undermine foreign interests? Could other African nations follow suit? Was Burkina Faso now drifting from Western influence? But Traoré never called it rebellion. He called it logic. A nation cannot survive if its strongest youth are only trained to destroy. They must be trained to build. The implications were massive. If you redefine defense as construction and reconstruction as sovereignty, then who holds the real power? The capital or the countryside? For the first time in decades, the soul of the nation was not being negotiated in ministries or embassies. It was being replanted in the soil, one trench at a time, by hands that had once carried guns. But outside Burkina Faso, the world wasn't watching quietly, because when an African nation turns its soldiers into farmers, Washington, Brussels, and Beijing all take notice. The silence from Western capitals was not indifference, it was discomfort. Burkina Faso wasn't protesting. It wasn't holding anti-Western rallies. It wasn't burning flags. It was doing something far more subversive. It was ignoring them. While Europe held summits and America debated military deployments in the Sahel, Ibrahim Traoré moved quietly and moved differently. He didn't request a loan. He didn't ask for training programs. He took 8,000 young men and simply said, "We will feed ourselves." That act alone, turning soldiers into farmers without permission or foreign oversight, rattled a deeply entrenched aid infrastructure. Think tanks in Washington labeled the move strategically risky. Policy analysts in Paris called it reckless decentralization. In Brussels, some officials privately questioned whether such independence could lead to a loss of leverage. But the most telling response came not in words, but in hesitation. Aid packages slowed, monitoring missions were postponed, investment proposals quietly stalled, because here was the uncomfortable truth: Burkina Faso's success, if sustained, could expose what many had quietly feared: that aid isn't always neutral, that dependency is a form of design, not destiny. By choosing not to beg for grain, Traoré had delivered a powerful, even dangerous message: self-reliance is a form of defiance. And in doing so, he forced a hard question onto the world stage. If African nations can feed themselves, who loses power? But while foreign governments hesitated, another group was paying close attention, and it wasn't in Washington or Paris. It was in the hearts of African youth across the continent. Across Africa, young people watched Burkina Faso's quiet revolution with growing hope and excitement. For years, youth had been told their futures lay beyond their borders, in Europe, America, or the Gulf. But now, they saw an alternative, a future where they could stay, build, and thrive at home. Social media buzzed with phrases like Green Brigade seeds of freedom and farmers, not fighters. In Niger, proposals emerged to retrain security forces as agricultural workers during dry seasons. In Guinea and Senegal, debates opened on transforming logistics units into food distribution hubs. The message was clear: change starts with taking control of the land. This shift was more than economic. It was deeply cultural and psychological. For decades, aid had shaped how Africans saw themselves, as perpetual recipients, dependent and waiting. Traoré's model challenged that narrative head-on, giving young Africans a new identity, rooted in strength, dignity, and self-sufficiency. One young activist tweeted, "If Burkina Faso can turn soldiers into farmers and end hunger, it's not just policy, it's prophecy." This ripple effect posed profound questions for Africa's future. Can more nations break free from aid dependency? Will this new model inspire a continent-wide reclaiming of food sovereignty? As the world watches, Burkina Faso isn't just growing crops, it's growing a movement rooted in the belief that Africa's power lies not in weapons or handouts, but in its soil and its people. Just when many thought Burkina Faso's radical experiment would remain a domestic policy, a surprising development sent ripples far beyond its borders. A small village in the Sahel became the stage for a quiet but powerful revolution in international perception. Former soldiers turned farmers, once overlooked and underestimated, began to attract international attention, not for their guns, but for their greenhouses, irrigation projects, and community rebuilding efforts. Global NGOs, initially skeptical, started sending delegations not to negotiate military aid, but to learn sustainable farming techniques from Burkina Faso's agricultural commandos. Meanwhile, African youth forums began to echo a new mantra: food is our front line, land is our legacy. Even rival governments across the region started exploring similar programs, seeing in Burkina Faso a blueprint for resilience that transcended traditional military power. This was no longer just about feeding a nation. It was about redefining what it meant to be powerful in the 21st century. President Ibrahim Traoré's vision was proving that true strength lay not in the barrel of a gun, but in the fertile soil underfoot and the determination of the people who nurture it. This twist flipped old paradigms on their head. The same uniforms that once signaled war now stood for work, renewal, and hope. The agricultural redeployment wasn't just a policy shift, it was a seismic power realignment. As Burkina Faso demonstrated success in feeding its people without foreign aid, Ibrahim Traoré's image transformed from a national leader to a continental symbol of African resilience and independence. No longer was power measured by the size of armies or the volume of foreign aid received. Instead, power was now measured by the ability to mobilize a nation's youth, reclaim its land, and rewrite its future. Traoré's initiative disrupted decades of dependency on Western governments and international organizations. This disruption unsettled many traditional power brokers, both inside and outside Africa, who saw Burkina Faso's self-reliance as a challenge to their influence. But to millions of Africans, especially young people, Traoré embodied hope and agency. He proved that sovereignty could be asserted through agriculture and community empowerment, not just political rhetoric or armed conflict. Across the continent, politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens began to reimagine leadership through this new lens. Traoré's Burkina Faso became a beacon, inspiring a wave of grassroots movements reclaiming control over land labor and destiny. His legacy was no longer confined to Burkina Faso's borders. It was now a blueprint for an Africa that refused to beg and chose to build. Burkina Faso's journey from conflict to cultivation is not just a story of crops and soil. It is the story of a nation reclaiming its dignity, rewriting its future, and redefining what true power means. Where once there were trenches, now there are fields that feed not only bodies, but hopes. Where once weapons were carried, now tools of creation are held, symbols of healing and renewal. President Ibrahim Traoré's words echo loudest. We do not ask permission to be free. We stand up and take it. This isn't just the triumph of one country. It is a call to all who believe in African self-determination and resilience.